The sun was slipping low across the sky, its golden glow dancing on the surface of the river. The air was warm, filled with the sounds of cicadas buzzing and the gentle murmur of water rushing over smooth stones. For Clara, the river had always been a place of peace. Since moving westward with her family, she had found comfort in its quiet rhythm, away from the dust and harsh voices of town. Carrying a basket of laundry against her hip, she headed to her usual spot, believing she was alone. But she wasn't. 3 men had been watching her from a distance, men with liquor on their breath and lawlessness in their eyes. They weren't strangers to violence. The frontier was full of men like them, drifting without ties, living by cruelty and chance. As Clara knelt on the smooth bank and dipped a sheet into the water, the crunch of boots on gravel made her stiffen. She turned, startled, and saw them closing in. "Evening, miss," one of them drawled, a sneer twisting his lips. His hand toyed with the edge of his belt, a gesture more threatening than casual. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. She clutched the wet sheet close, rising to her feet. I don't want trouble," she said quickly, stepping back toward the river. "Trouble?" Another laughed, his eyes roaming over her with a hunger that made her stomach turn. "We ain't looking for trouble, darling. Just some company." Her pulse thundered in her ears. She had heard whispers of what men like this did to women, left alone. But she had prayed she'd never face it herself. She tried to dart sideways, but one of them lunged, blocking her path. The smell of whiskey and sweat closed in around her. Panic flared. Clara dropped her basket and tried to run, but rough hands caught her arm, jerking her back so hard she nearly lost her footing. She screamed, but the wide wilderness swallowed her voice. No one from town would hear. No one would come. They shoved her down near the edge of the water, their shadows stretching long and jagged in the fading light. Clara fought wildly, clawing at them, her nails raking across skin, but their laughter drowned out her cries. The first man pressed her shoulders down while the others circled, their intentions sickeningly clear. In that moment, terror sank in, with a cruel weight. She was utterly powerless. The river that had once seemed so safe now felt like a trap, its steady current carrying her screams away. Clara closed her eyes, praying for a miracle. Any miracle. And that's when it came. Sharp whistle cut through the air. Then, thunk. An arrow struck the ground inches from one man's boot. He froze, startled. The others spun, scanning the tree line. From the shadow of the pines a figure emerged, silent, steady. His dark eyes locked on them like a hawk circling. Prey, an Apache warrior. The men cursed, stumbling back for a moment, though their bravado quickly returned. "A damn savage," one spat, pulling a knife from his belt. "This ain't your business." But the warrior didn't answer. His bow was already drawn, another arrow aimed with deadly precision. The tension in the string hummed like a warning. He had been watching long enough to see everything. His presence radiated calm power, the kind that came from a life sharpened by survival and honor. Clara, still trembling on the ground, looked up at him with wide eyes. She didn't know whether to fear him or cling to the hope he represented. All she knew was that this stranger, this Apache, had seen her suffering and chosen to step into the danger. The 3 men exchanged uneasy glances. The game had shifted. What moments before seemed like easy prey had turned into a standoff by the river, with a silent protector standing between them and their cruelty. And though Clara didn't yet know it, this moment would change everything. Yet, silence that followed the Apache's appearance was heavy, broken only by the rush of water and Clara's ragged breaths. The 3 men shifted uneasily, their bravado cracking at the sight of the bowstring drawn tight. One wrong move, and one of them would drop. The leader spat on the ground, forcing a smirk. "You think you can scare us, Redskin? 3 against 1. He twirled his knife, but the edge in his voice betrayed his doubt. The Apache did not flinch. He loosed the arrow in a blur, thunk, and it buried itself deep into the man's thigh. The outlaw howled, collapsing onto the dirt, clutching at the wound. The other two lunged forward with curses, rage boiling where fear had been. The warrior moved like water, smooth, flowing, unyielding. In one swift motion, he cast his bow aside and drew the long blade at his hip, the steel flashing in the dying light. The first man swung his fist, but the Apache ducked, driving his shoulder into the attacker's chest. The outlaw stumbled back, gasping as the wind was knocked from him. The second man came from behind, arms locking around the warrior's torso in a desperate attempt to hold him still. But the Apache twisted sharply, his elbow snapping back into the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The grip loosened, and with a spin, the blade slashed across the outlaw's forearm, sending his knife clattering to the ground. Clara scrambled backward, her heart in her throat, unable to look away. The chaos unfolded just feet from her, but the warrior fought with such precision it was as if the battle had been decided before it began. The wounded leader, blood soaking his trousers, staggered to his feet and lunged at the warrior with a snarl. For a moment, the three surrounded him, circling like wolves, but he remained calm, eyes sharp, feet steady in the dirt. Then the storm broke again, fists, steel and fury clashing against the single will of a man unwilling to yield. The Apache caught one outlaw's wrist, twisting until the man screamed and dropped his blade. With the same movement, he drove a boot into the man's chest, sending him sprawling into the river's shallows. The splash rang out across the bank, followed by sputtering curses. The other outlaw charged, swinging a club he had snatched from the ground. The warrior ducked low, sweeping the man's legs from beneath him. He crashed down hard, the breath knocked clean from his lungs. The Apache pressed his blade to the man's throat, and for a second the world froze. Then he pulled back, choosing mercy, and let him scramble away in terror. The leader, pale and desperate, dragged himself toward Clara, reaching for her as if to claim one last victory. But before he could touch her, the Apache stepped between them. His fist lashed out, striking the man square in the jaw. The outlaw crumpled, unconscious, blood seeping from the corner of his mouth. Silence returned. The fight was over. Clara's chest heaved as she tried to steady herself, her hands trembling as she clutched at her torn sleeve. The three men lay beaten, the one by the river moaning weakly, the others sprawled in the dirt. The Apache stood, tall among them, his blade lowered, but his eyes still sharp, scanning for danger. For the first time, his gaze softened as it met hers. Clara shrank back at first, her fear of him tangled with her relief. He extended a hand, not forcing, simply offering. His palm was steady, patient, her lips parted, but no words came. Slowly she placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was strong, grounding, pulling her gently to her feet. "You are safe now," he said, his voice low, firm, and strangely gentle. Clara stared at him, searching his face. She had expected a savage, wild, merciless, but what she saw instead was a man of honor, one who had risked himself for her when no one else would have heard her cries. The outlaws groaned, crawling away into the trees, broken and humiliated. The Apache did not stop them. His battle was done. His focus was on the woman before him, the woman who would not soon forget the warrior who came from the shadows to protect her. Clara stood trembling on the riverbank, the basket she had carried overturned, laundry scattered and dirtied in the struggle. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, and though the outlaws had retreated into the darkening trees, their laughter and cruelty still echoed in her ears. She tried to speak, but her throat tightened, as if the terror had stolen her voice. The Apache warrior remained a step away, his blade lowered, but still in his hand. His posture was watchful, calm, but she could see in his eyes that the fight had left him unshaken. He was a man who lived with danger, who expected it, and who met it without fear. That steadiness, that quiet power, unnerved her almost as much as it comforted her. "Go," he said simply, his voice deep but soft. He gestured toward the trail that led back toward the settlement. Clara hesitated. Her mind screamed at her to run. After all, hadn't she been warned all her life that Apaches were dangerous, merciless savages? But her heart held her still. This man had saved her, not harmed her. His arrows had flown for her. His blade had kept her safe. If he had wanted to hurt her, he could have done so already. Her knees wavered, and she sank onto a rock, covering her face with her hands. A sob escaped her, sharp and uncontrollable. She had been so close to losing everything, her dignity, her life, and the weight of it pressed down on her all at once. The warrior watched in silence. He did not step closer, but neither did he turn away. Instead, after a long moment, he sheathed his blade and crouched by the river, rinsing blood from his hands. The water ran red for a moment, then clear again, as if the river itself chose to wash away the violence it had witnessed. Clara peeked through her fingers, her sobs slowly quieting. She noticed the way he moved, deliberate, precise, almost ritualistic. Not the frenzy of a killer, but the calm of a man who believed in balance, in right and wrong. Gathering her courage, she finally whispered, Why did you help me?" Her voice cracked, fragile. He lifted his gaze, meeting hers without hesitation. "Because no woman should be treated as they tried to treat you," he replied. His English was rough, accented, but the meaning was clear. Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken such a simple truth to her with such weight. For the first time, she saw past the stories told in town, the ones that painted Apaches as heartless raiders. This man was not what they described. He was something else entirely, honorable. Still her fear lingered. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap as she tried to reconcile the two images in her mind. The warrior who fought like a storm, and the quiet figure now standing by the river, watching her with unreadable eyes. He rose to his full height and approached her, slowly, carefully, as though he understood she might flinch. In his hand he carried the sheet she had dropped, now damp and dirty. He held it out to her. Clara hesitated, then reached forward, their fingers brushing briefly. His touch was warm, grounding, and oddly reassuring. "Take it," he said. Her lips trembled into the faintest whisper of thanks. For a moment they stood in silence, the air between them heavy with things unspoken. Clara realized then that she was not merely grateful, she was indebted. Without him, she would have been lost. And though the thought frightened her, another part of her felt a spark of something different. Respect, perhaps even trust, beginning to take root. The warrior turned, scanning the forest once more before nodding toward the path. "I will walk. You back," he said. Clara swallowed hard, torn between instinct and reason. Yet when she looked at him, at the steadiness of his eyes and the calm strength in his stance, she nodded. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, she felt safe enough to breathe. And so, side by side, though with careful distance between them, the settler woman and the Apache warrior began their slow walk back toward the world that would not understand what had just begun between them. The trail back to Clara's home wound through thick pines and patches of tall grass, the shadows deepening as twilight stretched across the land. Each step seemed to echo louder than it should have, the silence between her and the Apache warrior, heavy, but not hostile. Clara clutched the basket against her chest, her eyes darting to him now and then, always uncertain, always curious. He walked with an ease that unsettled her, soundless, steady, as if the forest bent itself around his presence. He carried no torch, no lantern, yet he seemed to see everything, his sharp gaze sweeping the trees with every few steps. Clara realized that while she was busy stumbling over rocks and roots in her trembling state, he was already ensuring no danger could approach them. "Are you hurt?" His voice came suddenly, deep and even. Clara startled, tightening her grip on the basket. No. Not hurt. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She hesitated, then added softly, "Because of you." He didn't answer, just inclined his head slightly as though her words required no reply. The silence stretched on, but Clara found her thoughts racing. What would her family say if they saw her return with him? What would the townsfolk whisper if word spread that an Apache had walked her home? They would not care that he had saved her. They would only see him as the enemy, the savage. And yet, how could she in good conscience let their voices weigh more than her own eyes? She had seen the cruelty of white men at the river. She had seen the honor of an Apache who owed her nothing and yet gave everything. Her throat tightened again, not with fear this time, but with guilt. She remembered the stories she'd believed, the warnings she'd heard, the fear she'd carried all her life. And yet, if this warrior had believed those same stories about her kind, he would have left her screaming by the riverbank. At last, she gathered the courage to ask, "Why were you there? By the river?" He glanced at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "I was hunting. I heard your cry." She nodded slowly, her steps faltering as her mind lingered on that single word, cry. She hadn't thought anyone could hear. She hadn't thought anyone would come. They walked on, the lights of her family's cabin flickering faintly in the distance now. Clara's chest tightened as the glow came into view. Relief mingled with dread. Soon she would be safe in her home. But what would happen to him if her father or brothers saw him here? They carried rifles by the door, and their tempers were sharp. She stopped suddenly on the path, forcing him to pause as well. Her hands trembled, her voice shaking. "You can't come all the way. If they see you, they'll—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but he seemed to understand. "I know," he said simply. There was no bitterness in his tone, only certainty, as though he had long accepted the ways of her people. Still, the calmness of his acceptance stung her heart. Clara swallowed hard, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "They'll never know what you did for me," she whispered. "They'll never understand." The warrior's gaze softened, and for the first time, a faint trace of a smile touched his lips. "You will know," he said. The words sank into her, heavy and unshakable. Yes, she would know. She would carry this truth within her even if no one else ever believed it, that her life had been spared not by her own people, but by the hands of the man they called enemy. They stood in silence for a moment, the cabin light flickering closer, the world of prejudice and whispers waiting just ahead. Clara felt torn between stepping forward and turning back, between duty and gratitude. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you. For everything." The warrior gave a single nod, then stepped back into the shadows of the trees. In seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the night as though he had never been there. Clara stood staring after him, her heart pounding. Then, gathering her courage, she walked toward the cabin, carrying not just her basket, but the weight of a secret that had already begun to change her. The cabin door creaked open as Clara stepped inside, the basket still clutched to her chest. Warm light spilled across the wooden floor, the scent of stew lingering in the air. For a moment, the familiar sight of home should have comforted her, yet her body still trembled, her mind trapped between fear, relief, and a secret she dared not speak. Her mother was the first to notice. "Clara?" she said softly, frowning at the pale look on her daughter's face. She hurried forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "Child, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Clara tried to form words, but her lips parted and no sound came. Her father's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. He was a hard man, shoulders broad from years of work, eyes sharp and suspicious. "What's this?" he demanded, his tone sharper than he meant it. "What's wrong, girl?" I was at the river," Clara stammered, setting the basket down with shaking hands. The sheets inside were damp, dirt-streaked. bearing the marks of her struggle. She swallowed hard. 3 men. They came out of the woods. The room fell into silence, her mother's hand flying to her mouth, her father's jaw clenched tight. He stepped closer, his voice low, controlled. "Did they touch you?" Clara shook her head quickly, tears stinging her eyes. "No. They tried, but someone stopped them." Her father's brow furrowed. "Someone?" Clara hesitated, her heart hammering. She could see it all in her mind, the warrior's steady hand, the arrows, the way he had shielded her with his presence. But she also heard the voices of the townsfolk, their warnings, their hatred. If she spoke his name, if she told the truth, it would not be gratitude her family felt, but anger, suspicion, even violence. They would say it would have been better to die than to owe her life to an Apache. Her lips trembled. "Yes," she whispered. Someone passed through. They fought the men off and they left. It wasn't a lie, not exactly, but it wasn't the truth either. The truth belonged to her alone now, heavy and burning in her chest. Her father paced, fury rising in his eyes. "3 cowards laying hands on a woman," he growled. "If I find out who they were, they'll pay for it." He reached for the rifle propped against the wall, his jaw tight. Clara's mother reached for her hand, guiding her toward the table. "Sit, darling. You're safe now. That's what matters." She brushed a stray lock of hair from Clara's face, trying to soothe her trembling daughter. Safe. The word echoed in Clara's mind. Safe because of the man they would never thank. Safe because of the warrior who now melted into the shadows outside, nameless, faceless to them all. She lowered her gaze, silent, her thoughts a storm. She wanted to speak, to cry out that they were wrong about him, that they had no idea of the courage and honor he carried. But her tongue would not move. The walls of the cabin felt close, heavy, filled with the weight of prejudice. Later that night, after her family had gone to sleep, Clara sat by the small window, staring out into the dark woods. The night was quiet, but she couldn't shake the sense that he was still out there, watching, ensuring the men didn't return. Her heart softened at the thought. She pressed her hand lightly to the glass, whispering words no one but the night could hear. "Thank you." It was the beginning of a secret bond, one she knew would set her apart from her family and the town. For she had seen the truth with her own eyes, and truth, once seen, could not be unseen. Far from Clara's cabin, deep in the trees where the moonlight cut through in pale streaks, the 3 men staggered and cursed. Their bodies were battered, their pride broken. The leader limped heavily, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage he had tied around his thigh where the Apache's arrow had struck. His jaw throbbed, his vision blurred. But worse than the wounds was the humiliation. He spat into the dirt, his voice hoarse with rage. "A savage! A damn savage humiliated us, 3 of us, and he made us run like dogs." The second man nursed his arm, where the blade had opened a deep cut. His hand shook as he tried to keep pressure on it. "We should have killed him. If I'd had my rifle, you'd be dead before you even aimed," the third snapped bitterly. His lip was split, his face bruised from where the Apache had struck him. "Did you see the way he moved? That wasn't no ordinary fight. He meant to kill us." The leader slammed his fist against a tree trunk, wincing at the pain. "And he should have finished it, but he didn't. That's his mistake." He leaned, close to the others, his eyes burning with vengeful fire. "He left us alive, and now we'll make him pay. We'll make her pay too." At the mention of Clara, the second man shifted uncomfortably. "She'll tell her folks, the whole town. We'll hear about this." The leader sneered, baring his teeth. "And what will she tell them? That 3 men tried to take her, and some Apache came riding in like a hero? You think anyone will believe that? No, they'll believe we were the victims, ambushed by a savage. That's what we'll tell. And when the town's ready to ride, they won't be aiming for us. They'll be aiming for him." The other two exchanged wary glances. The plan made sense, twisted as it was. In a town already poisoned with fear and hatred of Indians, it wouldn't take much to stir men into violence. Still, the third man gritted his teeth. "But what about the girl? You gonna let her walk away after what she saw?" The leader's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "No. She's a loose tongue. One word different from ours, and we're ruined. When the time's right, we'll shut her mouth, for good." The air hung heavy with the promise of blood. The forest seemed to recoil around them, the whisper of the trees carrying their plotting like a warning. They began to stumble back toward town, each step fueled by spite. More than strength. Their wounds slowed them, but vengeance quickened their pace. By the time they reached the edge of the settlement, their story had already been shaped in their minds. 3 honest men, attacked by a savage lurking in the woods. They would play the part of victims, nursing their wounds in the saloon, letting their bruises and cuts speak louder than truth. They would stir the men of the town into anger, painting the Apache as a beast too dangerous to let live. And Clara? The leader's sneer deepened as he imagined her frightened face at the river. She might be safe tonight, but she had not escaped him forever. The thought of her defiance, her struggle, made his rage burn hotter. She had clawed at him, screamed at him, made him feel powerless. That was a debt he intended to settle. In the shadows, hatred and humiliation festered, twisting into something darker. The Apache warrior had won the battle by the river, but war, silent and treacherous, was already brewing in the hearts of the men he had spared. The town was small, little more than a dusty street lined with wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a church whose bell had grown silent with disrepair. It didn't take long for rumors to stir within its walls. By the next morning, the 3 men had already planted their story like poison roots. They limped into the saloon at dawn, bruised, bloodied, and full of righteous anger. Over mugs of whiskey, they spun their tale for eager ears, how they'd been ambushed at the river by a lurking Apache savage. They painted themselves as heroes who had barely escaped with their lives. The crowd, half drunk and eager for outrage, swallowed every word. "An Apache?" a farmer muttered darkly, gripping his mug so tightly the wood creaked. "Roaming this close to town? That can't be allowed." "They're like wolves," the blacksmith added, shaking his head. "You, let one sniff around, and soon a whole pack comes to raid your barns and slit your throats." The 3 men listened, hiding their smirks. The trap was already working. Soon men were muttering about organizing a hunting party, about making an example. None questioned whether the story was true. In a place already steeped in fear and prejudice, the lie had taken root too easily. But outside town, among the trees that edged the settlement, another pair of eyes watched. The Apache warrior had not returned to his camp. Instead, he lingered in the woods near Clara's cabin. He did not approach, did not let himself be seen, but he kept watch as he had the night before. His instincts whispered danger, and his instincts had never failed him. He crouched among the pines, scanning the horizon. His ears caught the faint carry of distant voices, angry, riled, swelling like a storm. He did not need to hear every word, to know what they were saying. The men he had spared would not stay silent. They would not accept their defeat quietly. Still, his gaze often returned to the cabin. Through the window he glimpsed Clara, moving about her chores with careful, restless motions. He could sense her unease even at a distance. Perhaps she too felt the storm gathering. That night, Clara found herself drawn once again to the window. The moonlight painted the woods in silver, and though she could not see him, she felt him. The thought both comforted and unsettled her, knowing he was there, watching, not like the men at the river had watched her, but in a different way. Protective, patient, a presence she could not bring herself to fear. Her father, however, noticed her distracted glances. "Something wrong, girl?" he asked gruffly as he smoked his pipe by the hearth. Clara startled, forcing a smile. No, Pa. Just tired. But inside, her heart raced. How could she tell him that the man he feared most was the one who had saved her? How could she explain that her safety now depended not on the rifles by their door, but on the silent warrior beyond the trees? The Apache knew the truth more clearly. He had seen men like those three before, cowards who struck in the dark, who twisted lies to turn others into weapons. They would come again, not just for him, but for her. He tightened his grip on the bow in his hand, his jaw set like stone. He had intervened once out of instinct, out of honor. But now? Now it was no longer a single act. The river had bound their fates together, and the danger had only just begun. From the woods, his eyes never left the cabin. By the following evening, the saloon had become a furnace of anger. Word of the supposed Apache ambush spread through town like wildfire. Farmers, ranchers, and drifters alike gathered with tight jaws and restless hands, their fear stoked into fury by the three outlaws who sat at the center of it all, their wounds displayed like trophies. "They'll be coming for the rest of us next," the blacksmith declared, slamming his mug down. "We can't just sit here while a savage roams free near our homes." A chorus of agreement rose. A plan began to form. A hunting party. Men spoke of rifles, torches, and riding out at dawn to scour the woods. By the end of the night, more than a dozen had pledged themselves to the cause. The three liars leaned back in satisfaction. Their story had done its work. Soon, the Apache warrior would be surrounded, outnumbered, and hunted like an animal. But not everyone was swept away by the tide of hatred. At Clara's cabin, the night was heavy with unease. She sat near the fire, staring into the flames, her mind replaying the horror at the river and the savagery of the men who had attacked her. Yet when she thought of the Apache, she saw not violence but strength, honor, and, most haunting of all, mercy. He had risked his life to save her, yet asked nothing in return. Now whispers of the hunting party had reached her ears. Her father had come home from town with the grim news. "They're riding out tomorrow," he muttered, pouring himself a drink. "And good riddance, too. About time somebody ran those devils back where they came from." Clara froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. She wanted to speak, to tell him the truth, but the words stuck in her throat. If she confessed, her father would never believe her. Worse, he might accuse her of lying, of shaming herself to defend a man the whole town already wanted dead. That night, when her father went to bed, Clara stepped quietly outside. The air was cool, the moon veiled by thin clouds. She stood on the porch, her hands trembling as she whispered into the darkness. "I know you're out there." For a long moment, there was only silence, broken by the chirp of crickets. Then, from the shadows beneath the trees, he emerged, silent, tall, his eyes catching the faint glow of moonlight. Clara's breath caught. Though part of her had known, he was near. The sight of him so close still stole her words. He stopped a few paces away, his presence as steady as stone, waiting for her to speak. "They're coming for you," she finally whispered. "Not just 3 men this time. The whole town. At dawn." His face did not change, though his eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected this. He had lived long enough to know how quickly fear could turn into a mob. "You should go," she urged, her voice cracking. "Please, if you stay, they'll kill you. And—" She faltered, her throat tightening. "And I don't want them to." The Apache studied her, his silence deep as the night. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm. "Do not run." Clara's heart twisted. He was not reckless, she could see that in him. But there was a pride, an unshakable resolve, that would not allow him to flee. Before she could speak again, he turned his gaze toward the town, where faint lantern lights still flickered. His hand brushed the bow at his side, and though he said, "No more," Clara understood. He would face whatever came, not for glory, not for revenge, but because it was the only way he knew to live. She watched him melt back into the forest, her chest tight with dread. The storm was gathering, and by dawn, the woods would burn with anger, fear, and blood. And Clara, for the first time, realized the terrible truth. If she did nothing, the man who had saved her life would surely lose his. The first rays of sunlight painted the horizon in streaks of red and gold. But in town, the beauty of morning was swallowed by the grim purpose of men. Horses stamped and snorted outside the saloon as rifles were checked, bullets loaded, and torches prepared. More than a dozen townsmen had gathered, their faces hard with resolve. At the center of them stood the three outlaws, bandaged and bruised, but smiling behind their false bitterness. They played their parts well, limping, wincing, growling about the Apache beast that had nearly ended them. "Today, we put an end to it," the leader declared, his voice carrying over the restless crowd. "No more savages lurking by our rivers. No more danger for our women and children. We ride." Cheers erupted, and in a wave of dust and hooves, the men set off into the wilderness. From her cabin, Clara heard them before she saw them. The thunder of hooves rolled across the land like distant thunder. She rushed to the window, her heart slamming as the column of armed men cut a line into the trees. Her father stepped onto the porch, rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression grim. "You're going," she whispered, fear tightening her voice. He nodded. "Can't sit by, Clara. A man's got to do his part." She wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him everything, but the words caught like thorns in her throat. If she confessed, he might look at her differently, not as his innocent daughter, but as a girl tainted by scandal. And worse, he might not believe her at all. So she stood in silence, watching him ride away with the others, the weight of her secret pressing down until she could scarcely breathe. Meanwhile, deep in the woods, the Apache warrior was already moving. He had risen before dawn, sharpening his blade, restringing his bow, preparing his horse for swift movement if needed. He did not underestimate the white men. A mob of armed riders could cut through the trees like fire through dry grass. But he also knew the land better than any of them. Every ridge, every hollow, every thicket of brush was his ally. The forest was not their home. It was his. And if they meant to hunt him, then they would not find easy prey. Still, as he crouched, among the pines, listening to the rising rumble of hooves, he thought of her, the girl by the river, the one he had saved, the one who had stepped out into the night to warn him. Her eyes had carried fear, yes, but also something else. Trust. He did not understand why that thought lingered, even now, on the edge of battle. But it did. The hunting party reached the river by mid-morning, spreading out in a rough line, their rifles ready. The leader of the three outlaws urged them forward with exaggerated caution. "He'll be close. Injured, maybe. Stay sharp." They prodded through the underbrush, scanning the shadows. Birds scattered into the sky at their noise. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. But the Apache was not there. Not yet. He watched from higher ground, his sharp eyes following their every move. He counted their numbers, studied their formation, and chose his ground carefully. This was not a fight he wanted. But if they forced his hand, he would strike not with the desperation of prey, but with the precision of a hunter. Back at the cabin, Clara paced the floor, her mind a storm of dread. She imagined the men finding him, surrounding him, cutting him down. She pressed her hands to her mouth, her heart screaming against her silence. And then, with sudden clarity, she realized, if she said nothing, she was as guilty as the men who hunted him. Her choice could no longer be postponed. The hunting party pressed deeper into the forest, their boots crushing fallen branches, their rifles glinting whenever sunlight broke through the canopy. Every Man carried anger in his chest, anger stoked by lies and fear. Yet beneath it all, unease lingered. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals. It felt as though the land itself was holding its breath. The Apache warrior moved like a shadow above them. From a ridge, he tracked their path, his eyes cold and calculating. He knew these men weren't here by accident. The three he had spared had poisoned them with their lies. Now the mob came not for justice, but for blood. He knocked an arrow and let it rest against the bowstring, testing the weight. He could fell the leader in an instant. One strike, one lesson. But there were too many rifles, too many eyes. A single arrow would unleash a storm. And though his body was ready, his spirit reminded him this was not his fight. Not until they forced it to be. The three outlaws, riding near the front, exchanged uneasy glances. Their bravado had carried them this far, but in the silence of the woods, even they felt exposed. The leader spat into the dirt, masking his fear with anger. "Spread out! He's here somewhere!" The men obeyed, forming a ragged line. The forest swallowed them in uneven gaps, rifles twitching at shadows. And then a voice broke the silence. "Stop!" It was sharp, trembling, but carried enough strength to halt their steps. Heads whipped around. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was Clara. Her dress was torn from running, her breath unsteady, but her eyes blazed with desperate courage. "What in God's name are you doing here, girl?" her father barked from the line. Clara stepped forward, clutching her, fists at her sides. "You're chasing the wrong man. He's not your enemy." Murmurs rippled through the group. Confusion spread like a ripple in still water. The leader of the three outlaws went pale, then quickly masked it with a sneer. "Don't listen to her," he snapped. "She don't know what she's saying. That savage nearly killed us. He saved me!" Clara's voice cut through like a blade. The words silenced even the birds in the trees. She looked around at the men, her face pale but unyielding. "Those three, you think they're heroes?" "They tried to—" Her voice broke, but she forced the words out. "They tried to hurt me by the river. He stopped them. He's the reason I'm alive." The silence that followed was heavy as stone. Her father's face twisted in disbelief. "Clara, what are you saying?" The Apache watched from above, his breath steady. He had not expected this. The girl had risked everything, standing against her own people, to speak the truth. The three outlaws panicked. The leader raised his rifle, fury burning in his eyes. "She's lying! Can't you see? She's been tricked by the savage!" But before he could level the weapon, a whistle split the air. An arrow flew like lightning, knocking the rifle clean from his hands. The mob gasped, stumbling back in shock. From the ridge, the Apache stepped into view at last. Tall, unflinching, bow-drawn, he was no longer a ghost in the shadows, but a presence no man could ignore. The standoff stretched tight as a drawn bowstring. The mob's anger faltered, shaken by Clara's words and the warrior's silent defiance. The forest seemed to lean closer, waiting for the breaking point. For a long, breathless moment, it seemed as if the first shot would ignite a war. But Clara's voice rose again, steady despite the tears burning her eyes. "If you kill him, you'll be murderers, just like them." She pointed at the three men, her hand trembling but firm. "The truth is here. You can't bury it anymore." The Apache's bow remained steady, but behind his eyes was something new, something rare. Respect. The woods had become a battlefield, but Clara had turned it into a trial of truth. And the outcome, at last, no longer rested on weapons alone.